many a long weekend. It's very noble of you to be spending this time with us here instead of out there by the lake. So we'll get started, and hopefully we can move through fairly quickly, have a drink afterwards, and then get out into what's left of the sunshine. My name is Richard Lennane. I'm Director of the Geneva Disarmament Platform, or GDP as we call it. And the GDP is one of the 6 or 7 partner organisations who have been organising this series on the Geneva Dialogues, Securing Our Common Future, which is the title of the Secretary-General's Agenda for Disarmament, which, as you remember, was released in May this year. This is the 4th of the series of Geneva Dialogues that we've held. Partner organisations have convened to discuss this document and to talk about how we might take it forward in practical ways. And as you know, I know many of you have attended the previous events, each event was dedicated to a specific chapter of the Secretary-General's agenda. I was asked by some of our other partners not to refer to this as the 4th and final Geneva Dialogues because they think that might sort of suggest to people that we're closing off the discussion here, when in fact we want the opposite. We hope that these dialogues would start a discussion that would continue. So welcome to the 4th Geneva Dialogue. We hope there will be several more and that it will move in a productive and useful direction. When I've asked people, what did you think of the Secretary-General's agenda, there have been a number of reactions, but probably the most common one has been, I haven't read it. And this is perhaps not too surprising because it's quite a substantial document. It's, 70 or 80 pages. So perhaps only the most dedicated disarmament aficionados have ploughed their way all the way through it. Nonetheless, the way it's set out, you can pick out the parts of the agenda that are most relevant for you and look at that. And today, in the 4th edition, we're looking at the chapter on strengthening partnerships for disarmament. And each of the partner organisations in organising these events has sort of picked the topic or the chapter that was most interesting to them. We asked to do this one at the GDP because our function as a platform is really that, to build and strengthen partnerships, to facilitate and promote disarmament activity in Geneva and elsewhere. So thank you again for joining us. What we're going to do, each of the events has been a bit different in the way it's been structured and set up, which is fine. We like variety. And in this event, as you can see, we have a very small panel, so it's not going to be a long series of talks and lectures. Perhaps you're relieved to see that. I certainly would be. And we want it really to be a dialogue. So you've already proved your dedication and interest by coming under these conditions. Please show further by pitching in and just raising your hand or pressing your microphone button if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment. We'll do it in a way, I'll give each of our guests a chance to say a few things, but we're not going to be rigid about it. If they say something and you want to immediately clarify something or ask a question, just jump in. That's absolutely fine. And we're going to, if you look, for those of you who have read part 5 of Securing Our Common Future, the chapter on strengthening partnerships for disarmament, and there are some spare copies at the entrance if you want to do that now. The chapter is divided into 5 parts, looking at different ways of strengthening partnerships. And those are retooling multilateral disarmament processes and institutions, engaging regional organisations, ensuring the equal, full and effective participation of women, empowering the young generation, and I love this, it's like a movie title, the ultimate force of change, and enhancing participation by civil society and engagement by the private sector. We're not going to tackle them in the order in which they appear because we thought it would actually make more sense to rearrange things a bit and actually to finish with the first one, which is retooling, talking about the disarmament machinery, because we thought what would make most sense is to talk about engaging these other partners and so on, and then at the end talk about what that actually means for us, as for you as diplomats in the disarmament machinery in Geneva. What are you going to do about it? What is the UN going to do about it? What lessons can we take from the agenda itself and from the discussion we've had with our guests today and all of you? So what we're going to start with is in fact the youth, civil society and private sector. And let me at this point introduce our two guests. Firstly, on my left, I'm very, very pleased and grateful to Ronit Langer, who's from the United States. She's just flown in this morning from Boston, especially for this event. We thought it would be most useful to us as diplomats, disarmament officials, if we're talking about engagement and empowerment of youth, to actually hear from a real live young person. So we found one. And Ronit is an undergraduate student at the MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which I'm sure all of you know is a very prestigious and well-known technical university in the United States. Ronit's just starting her third year of that 4-year Bachelor of Science degree. She's studying computer science, bioinformatics. But most importantly, and why we've asked her to come and speak to us today, is that she was a member of the iGEM, the MIT iGEM team. iGEM is the International Genetically Engineered Machines competition. It's a global competition for undergraduate students involving synthetic biology, using synthetic biology techniques to build systems. Ronit will tell us some more about it. But the point is that this is a global competition. It involves emerging technologies, it involves young people, and it involves very important issues of governance of potentially dangerous technology, and as we'll hear, implementation of the Biological Weapons Convention. So thank you very much, Ronit, for coming all this way to talk to us, and we're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. On my right is Dr. Renata Dalaqua. Renata's from Brazil. She's just started working at UNIDIR as a researcher on gender, but Renata has a very long experience working on disarmament and arms control issues in Brazil and abroad. Her PhD was on Brazil's nuclear program, and I learned today that she's in fact the author of the Wikipedia page on Brazil's nuclear program, which is an excellent page. I looked at it after. So I commend that to you. But again, we're very grateful to have your experience to contribute to our discussion today. So we'll kick off with that. We'll come later to the question of regional organisations and a special story about that, which I'll tell you a bit later. But why don't we start with you, Ronit, if you could tell us a bit about... Well, one thing I should have mentioned, Ronit, among other things, this is her second visit to the United Nations in Geneva, because she was an iGEM delegate, as they call it, to the Biological Weapons Convention meeting of states parties last December. So she was able to see multilateral disarmament diplomacy in action, all of that, and to get a first-hand assessment of how we, as diplomats, as government representatives, as UN officials, are dealing with the kinds of threats that biology and biotechnology are throwing out. It's a scary story. Ronit, why don't you tell us all about it?
Okay. First of all, I'd just like to say thank you so much for having me here. This is really an excellent opportunity, and I hope that for all the youth that I'm representing, I do it well. So, I first wanted to start off by saying that I think my generation has a very, whatever my generation means, we can discuss that later, but I think it has a very entrepreneurial spirit. I think that we feel that something big is coming, and there are a lot of different frontiers that we're trying to explore, whether it be in climate change or biology or in computer science. There's so many different avenues for us to explore, and we just want to go. There's this push, there's this drive, especially coming from an institution like MIT. It's just, let's go, 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 go. And while that's excellent, and I think it's going to be really great for progress, it comes at a little bit of a detriment, because there's this really big anti-big company vibe, especially in the biotechnology industry, which I'm involved in, especially in the Boston area. There's this really big anti-big pharma as these just giant organizations that have just been slowed down by bureaucracy. They're not ready to make changes. And if we think that big pharma is a problem, we're really, really, really wary of the government and governments in general. And they're seen as like these big regulators, and who would work for the government? They're just trying to slow down progress. And I think that's a really dangerous sentiment to be floating around. And I don't think that my generation's unique in this. I just think that the problems that we're facing are getting bigger, and they're getting more widespread. And it's the type of thing that we can't allow this rhetoric to go on. We can't allow the people who are now undergraduates to go into the workforce with this kind of mentality, because they just want to hit the ground running, and there needs to be some kind of conversation. There needs to be a continued dialogue to be like, hold up, the things that you are doing have really big impact, and they have more impact than they've ever been able to have before. And I think this is where organizations like iGEM come into play. So iGEM, as Richard already mentioned, is the International Genetically Engineered Machines Competition. And what it does is it brings together 300 different teams from across the globe to compete in a genetic engineering competition. And it culminates in this giant jamboree that takes place in Boston. You can see the picture of it behind me, of these thousands of undergrads who've been engaged for 9 months in research, and they come to this 4-day conference. And it's an amazing sight to see all these really young people so passionate about their research. And I think iGEM really captures that entrepreneurial spirit of wanting to create things and wanting to create something totally novel despite only being an undergrad. iGEM really gets rid of that dichotomy and says that any young person is really capable of doing science. But also, at the same time, iGEM weaves into the fabric of its competition this policy kind of awareness that you have to have. One of the main components of the competition is you have to prove to the judges how your project interacts with the world and how the world interacts with your project. And what that means is before you even sit down to do any science or any planning, you're expected to go do outreach. You're expected to go to your community, to the leaders of the field that you're trying to enter, and ask them what's out there and actually talk to real people and make sure you've done your background and done your homework. And then what you need to do is, after you've done your research and after you prove that your thing works, you need to be able to kind of have a plan for how it's going to look in the world and what policy would look like surrounding this kind of technology. For example, I was on MIT's iGEM team in 2017, and we were doing a CRISPR project, which is a gene editing protein. And anytime you say the word gene editing, everyone in the room kind of freezes up a little bit. And so we were actually able to talk to experts, especially at MIT, and leverage that position of being at such an incredible research institution to really think about these topics very critically. And so I left that conference just full of hope and so many wonderful things and wonderful people were going to be entering this new world that we were ready to create. And then at this conference, they advertised that they were having this delegate program where they were going to be taking students who had participated in iGEM to the Biological Weapons Convention. And it was an opportunity to really have our voices as young people heard on this international stage, because we had been thinking about it really critically over the past couple of months in our smaller groups and our own teams, but this was an opportunity to really see it play out on the world stage. And actually, I was in this very room where we presented our work to a very different audience than the one we had presented in November. It was only a month's difference. And it was interesting to me because throughout that week, I went to various different side conversations that were going on. And something that I noticed was that the same thing that was making me so excited about iGEM and that whole experience of empowering young people was what terrified everybody else in the room. And that, to me, sort of signifies this dichotomy that we need to break down, as in, this generation, we're scared of the regulation, we're scared of what it means, we're scared of the halt to our progress that could mean, but also, and they're scared of us, that we're gonna, jump the gun and create something so terrifying and so horrible. So I really think that the opportunity to come to the Biological Weapons Convention and really see how policy is done and how international relations happened, it was a life-changing experience. And I couldn't just go home and go back to, back in the ivory towers and just doing science in a vacuum. It wasn't possible anymore, which is why I'm just so excited to be here today to continue this conversation. And I think that we need more people who have experiences like me, because it was just so powerful. And I think that the more people you can get involved in the conversation, especially at a young age, the better off we're going to be. Because right now the rhetoric is, especially at a place like MIT that's so scientifically minded, is stay away from politics, it's all a mess, or stay away from policy. And we need to change that, because otherwise the gap's just going to grow wider. Thank you.
Thanks, Ronit. Your enthusiasm is really infectious, and I hope some of us can take it away with us. I wonder if you could tell us two more things. Firstly, when you came to the BWC meeting and you sat in the big conference room over there and you saw these delegates behind their national flags and making speeches, you told me a little bit about this earlier today. Can you just give us some of your first impressions of that as a young scientist coming to see diplomacy in action, if you will? And then also just tell us a little bit about iGEM's safety and security program. And I was very interested in your expression. You said this is woven into the fabric of the competition, these policy questions, these safety concerns. So your impressions of the diplomacy and then the safety and security aspect.
Of course. So I think what first struck me when I got to the BWC was that I'm used to scientific conferences where people get up and they present slides and there's a lot of data, a lot of statistics. And the first day of the conference was a lot of people sitting and reading their kind of agendas, and it took a long time for me to be able to hear sort of what was happening beyond all the policies speak, which was a very interesting experience and very different and something I just wasn't used to. And it was also became very clear to me very quickly how a lot of people in the room didn't necessarily have the type of scientific background that is necessary to understand all of these new challenges on a higher level. Not to say that I have that understanding, but it was very clear to me that there were issues and things that were coming up that most of the topics that were spoken about felt decades old, like problems from the 80s and 90s, and not really addressing the frontier of what was happening. And that was very terrifying, because the frontier is coming, and I just had seen it happen at the competition just the month before. And so I was really hoping that conversation would come out, and I was disappointed but also empowered to sort of continue that conversation and really get it moving from our side. So that was sort of first impressions. And then in terms of iGEM's safety and security program, so the way it works is that, so for iGEM at the beginning of the season, sends you a basic kit. They call it like the biological building blocks that contain bacterial plasmids and things of that nature to sort of help you get started. And any other substance or material that you want to use on top of that has to be passed through the Safety and Security Committee. So the Safety and Security Committee, I think, is 30 people at this point, and they review every single one of the 300 team security applications. And so the way it's set up is that there's kind of a white list of materials that if you're using those materials, you're most likely to get the go-ahead. And then after that, if you're using any materials that fall outside of that, you'll get a call from the Safety and Security Committee. Why do you think you want to do this? Like, what is the purpose of this? How are you going to ensure your safety? And also, the other important point is that the final safety and security form needs to be filled out by the principal investigator who leads the lab. So it needs to be someone who is kind of running the back end and is really supervising. So it's not just, yes, it's empowering, but with proper regulations put in place.
Thanks, Renata. The reason I asked you to sort of explain that process, and I don't know how many of you maybe picked that up, I'm sure that Daniel did, but what Ronit has just described, in fact, is implementing the Biological Weapons Convention. So this is in fact a group of several thousand undergraduate science students who are putting into practice the provisions as agreed and elaborated by the states parties to the BWC. They are putting that into practice, not through government legislation, not through overt regulation, but through voluntarily applied a set of conference rules that reaches now across the globe. And thousands of young biologists and other scientists are now putting into practice the principles of the BWC and implementing that treaty in a way probably as diplomats we would never think about. And it's happening right now. It's been happening for several years. If you follow the BWC very closely, I'm sure you've at least heard of it. But for those in other areas of disarmament and other areas of multilateral diplomacy, this would be news. And I think it's both very exciting and encouraging, but it's also a bit of a wake-up call to traditional diplomacy, because the new generation is coming and they're taking things, in a sense, out of our hands. Maybe that's a good thing. We'll talk some more about that. Okay, let's turn now to the next subtopic, if you like, which is the ensuring the equal, full and effective participation of women. And Renata's going to take us through that.
Thank you. I'd also like to thank everyone that is here today. As Richard said, I just moved to Geneva. It's been a month. I'm with UNIDIR. I'm really happy with this opportunity, and also happy with the discussion we are having here today about the Secretary General's agenda and partnerships for disarmament. I have some. Let's see. So first, I'd like to start by recalling something that the Secretary General himself said when launching this agenda here in Geneva. He said his agenda covers everything from hand grenades to hydrogen bombs. And I think that's true. We are here now, fourth event, unpacking all the contents of this document. And I guess this shows also the width and the depth of the document, but also the complexity of disarmament itself. The section we are addressing today on partnerships is the section where the Secretary General expresses his commitment to ensuring the equal, full, and effective participation of women in international security and disarmament frameworks. He also says he'll work towards gender parity in all boards, panels, and expert groups which are relevant to the field of disarmament. So I guess before addressing this goal of gender parity, we can also have a look at where we are now in terms of gender balance in our field, international security and disarmament. UNIDIR and IUP in 2016 conducted a study analyzing data for the past 30 years on participation of women and men in international security forums, and they came out with results which I think are something we already know, that there is a systematic gender imbalance in these forums. There is a pattern of men overrepresentation and women underrepresentation. And the Secretary General wants to achieve gender parity because, as he says, it is a moral duty and an operational necessity. I have some slides here with some graphs for us. This study, the 2016 study, it can be downloaded from UNIDIR's website. It has more charts than these ones. I just brought a few to get the conversation started. So here, this slide, we have gender balance in first committee of the General Assembly in 2015, the NPT Review Conference of 2015, the CWC in 2013, and the DWC in 2011. What we can see is that the ratio of women delegates varies between 26 and 30%. Here we have a second graph focused on the NPT review conferences. The data goes back to the 80s up to 2015, which was the last review conference. And the numbers are presented by regions. So actually the highest number we have on our left side here is Latin American Caribbean in 2015, where women represented 37% of the delegates, but that's above the average. The average is the kind of orange line, and it never exceeds 30%. It's 27% there. Thirdly, we have another graph that shows the first committee, the third committee, and the review conference, the NPT review conference. So we can see that first committee and NPT review conference have similar patterns of women participation. And the third committee, which deals with cultural, social, and humanitarian issues, actually is doing much better in that sense. They had 48% of women in 2015, which is a bit far from our reality in international security. And here also a share of female heads of delegations across forums. Also we can see the third committee doing better, but still these numbers have varied. They have varied, but they don't exceed 30%. So what does this mean? It means that women are marginalized in forums that deal with international security. So a group that makes up half of our population is represented only up to 30% in these forums. We can try to talk about the causes of that in our discussion. But regardless of that, from a moral perspective, as the Secretary General states, this is not fair. It is not equal on the basis of democratic norms, and it goes against international standards on women's rights and women participation. But let's remember, the Secretary General also said that gender parity is an operational necessity. And why is that? So studies have shown that a diverse composition of a decision-making body is something valuable to this decision-making process, in the sense that it favors group prediction and problem solving. And that I guess is the point of the partnerships for disarmament. We can also include more young people and have a different perspective on the same issue. When we have, in terms of gender, when we have diversity present in the discussion, this may mean that we will have a different set of questions being asked, and these questions can be specifically about the needs of men and women in a given context, whether these needs are different or not, and if they're being taken into consideration by the policy process. So let me briefly exemplify this issue, assessing the problem of guns and gun violence through a gender perspective. So most of the world's small arms are in male hands. Most of the people that work in professions that you need to use small arms, which is police, military, private security, are men. Most of the perpetrators of small arms violence are male, and most of the victims too. Of the people who die violently every year around the world in conflict zones or elsewhere, more than 80% are male. Less than 20% are female. I mean, women also engage in violent behaviors, including with small arms, but they tend to do less so frequently than men. And while men represent the largest share of the population who die from small arms, women and girls are exposed to many forms of gender-based violence, including rape, forced pregnancy, sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, forced prostitution, so on. So what are the implications of this to conflict prevention, for gun control, for disarmament? Knowing that small arms are connected to gender-based violence, researchers, experts, activists, and member states managed to include a clause in the Arms Trade Treaty that actually requires states parties to take into account the possibility that the exported materials will be used to commit gender-based violence. But gender is not only about women, it is also about men. And if we want to tackle the issue of gun violence, as the numbers show, we also have to have a conversation about men and masculinities, violent masculinities. And the ATT example shows that it's important to generate gender disaggregated data. It is important to ask these questions. It is important to look at the field and to try to see what the numbers are telling us. And then it is important to make sure that states are using this information in the treaties, in the regulations they are crafting. Otherwise, there is a chance that arms control and disarmament initiatives that are gender blind or profess to be gender neutral will actually reinforce existing inequalities between men and women. And just to make another point, a final point, while it is important to state that we are in favor of gender perspectives being taken into account into the disarmament process, this is a very general statement. I guess progress will be made when we break down the gender dynamics at play in each specific disarmament framework. And this is something that UNIDIR can help with. We are actually an autonomous institute within the UN, and we are offering support to member states that are interested in engaging in this conversation and in actually moving from words to action, making gender more than just a paragraph in disarmament dialogue and actions. And I can talk more about what UNIDIR is doing or why it is important that we struggle for diversity in disarmament forums, and yeah, I look forward to listening to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renata, for that very concise and accessible overview of these issues. I think you really hit the mark at the end there, saying, well, okay, so what are we going to do with this? How do we turn this from, as you put it, a paragraph in every report and disarmament document into actual concrete actions? And if we look at the Secretary General's agenda, while it covers much of the same ground you've talked about this afternoon, it's quite short on concrete proposals for how to improve the inclusion of women and to change the figures you showed us on the graphs. So I'm very interested, when we open the floor in a minute, to hear your ideas about what we can actually do about this. And I know of at least one delegate here who has some, which is good news. I wanted to also ask, in fact, we have a bit of an intersection here because someone was telling me a story, and this person told me today that they didn't want to be identified or associated with this story. So I'll anonymize it for you. But they're saying they were wondering out loud whether, for example, in the Conference on Disarmament, the fact that how can I put this politely, the average age of the participants is quite high, if this was correlated with the very low ratio of participation of women, and that if you look at forums, organisations which compose of more younger people, if the gender proportions are more even, and what is that relationship? And this person said that, the CDs, I'm paraphrasing, the CD is full of old men, and these ambassadors come and when they arrive, they make their sort of maiden speech in the council chamber, and they often say something like, I was first posted to the Conference on Disarmament 30 years ago as a young second secretary, and so on. So I'd be interested in thoughts from both of you really on this connection between youth and gender, and if we can encourage or engage more with young people, will that help with the gender problems? Conversely, if we can improve our work inclusivity of women, will that help to encourage young people? What do you think, Renata?
Yeah, I can go. I don't know. I think a lot of people see gender as a new agenda. And that being said, it was not a concern when the previous generations were becoming part of the diplomatic academies and things like that. I know, for instance, in Brazil, I think it's from 3% of women diplomats, I think now they have 20%, but still, So I think it's a problem that, it's an issue that goes back to capitals too, in order to get a full picture of this issue. We have also to look at the capitals, how these issues are dealt there. But I also think, in addition to the generational quest, there is also the militarism that is attached to international security forums. I think that is also an aspect of the way it has been constructed throughout the decades. It's something that can be an obstacle to the participation of women, because wars and guns and this type of things are seen as masculine. So I think in the disarmament area we have a melting pot of different problems.
Well, let's need some melting pot of solutions. Ronit, what do you think?
So I can't really speak to international security and things like that, but it is interesting being at a technological institution where the numbers on the ground are, yes, like my class is 50% female, 50% male, but that's not the spirit of it. And in the same way that military is still it's a very masculine thing, the sciences and engineering are also still very masculine things, and getting involved and speaking up is something that is not necessarily always encouraged of women, not necessarily because of anybody telling them, but because of the sort of innate response you get when you tell someone that you're going, like, to do, when I told people that I was going to do things like this, they're happy for me, but they're also a little bit wary. They're like, can you handle that? And I'm like, yes, I can, thank you. But it's not there as overtly as I think it has been in the past, but it's still there. And especially because right now you have that a lot of the people in power, I mean, especially in my case, the professors and the people that you're looking up to as role models are very predominantly male, which presents a big challenge in terms of trying to weave together all the different things that you want to do, like, and accomplish from someone who doesn't necessarily share all your same concerns. So,
Richard, if I may continue, it's just that we are here speculating, right? I brought some data, but we are a research institute at UNIDIR, and we're actually in the process of updating these numbers and also trying to come up with hypotheses of why this has been like this, and what are the obstacles and how can we change that. And in addition to looking to the quantitative analysis, like coding for participants list, we also intend to conduct like focus group with disarmament practitioners and try to ask them for insights too. And I don't know if the generational aspect has like people agreeing on that they may be something that could explain this. We can also try to do a correlation of gender and age in different forums. I don't know, try to compare with a newer agenda, for instance, human rights and environment, and see if those fields are actually doing better in terms of gender parity than international security and disarmament. So I mean, like from the point of view of a researcher, this is all very exciting, this hypothesis, and I think there are quantitative and qualitative methods we can pursue and try to come up with explanations and perhaps improve things too.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's very encouraging to hear, and I hope potential donors are listening to you. Yeah, there are things we can do. There's research to be done. There are hypotheses to be developed. Sergey, is it something immediate?
No.
No. Oh, yeah, I'll come back in just a moment. Ronald, I just wanted to link this to one other aspect, which is in the Secretary General's agenda, and that is in talking about engaging youth and empowering youth. It does make a very important point that for many young people in developing countries, they're effectively excluded from this kind of participation because they don't have the resources to, for example, travel to international meetings or to participate in competition. What is your impressions of iGEM, the competition itself, in terms of fairness of representation? Are there teams from developing countries? How well are they represented? Are they able to participate effectively? And yeah, your thoughts on that?
So I think right now the representation is not amazing. I mean, most of the competitors come from the United States and European countries, but I think what iGEM is doing is it has a staff where they have people dedicated to each region, and they have these iGEM ambassadors. It's the program that they're running where they get people, they sign on for basically like a year-long internship to represent the region that they come from, and these ambassadors come from all over the world, and their job is to go back to their countries or to their regions and really encourage teams. I think the struggle that iGEM faces is that iGEM doesn't monetarily support any of these, any of the competitors, and they don't really have resources available. What they do say, and what they make a point of every year, is that as iGEM grows as a concept and it has more name recognition and the projects get more and more complex and more important, then people are more willing to give money to help support these teams. But I mean, coming from a research institution like MIT, we didn't have to do any fundraising, which I think inherently biases the competition, and it's nothing that iGEM could really do about it, but they really are looking to put out as many resources as possible in terms of personnel to sort of support you through that process, even if they can't support you monetarily, and they're always looking to expand into new regions. But it's a slow process, especially because a lot of the countries that they're looking to move into are kind of very hesitant to let them come in. There's a level of distrust there that needs to be worked out.
Okay, that's some interesting factors there. So it's not, these problems of inclusion and engagement with partners is not obviously limited to the UN and to multilateral processes. What I think we'll do now is move on to regional questions. And this is a story, a sort of meta presentation, if you like. Because when we went around looking for people to speak about these different subtopics in this chapter, we of course contacted the regional organisations that are represented in Geneva, like the League of Arab States and the African Union, even the Pacific Islands Forum, so to see if they could come and talk to us about how they see their role in disarmament and what they think of the Secretary General's agenda and so on. And it's a rather sad reflection, I think, of the situation, and this is even acknowledged in the Secretary General's document, that engagement with regional organisations on disarmament is not as good as it could be or that you might expect. It says, and there's good reason for regional organisations to be involved. If you read in the opening paragraph, it says regional arrangements can reinforce general norms and principles, complement multilateral treaties and regimes, and tailor approaches in disarmament to local contexts, which is a very good reason from the disarmament perspective of why working with regional organisations and within regions is important. But what it doesn't really get at is what's in it for the regional organisations, and what's in it for the regions. Why is disarmament important to them in pursuing their goals and their priorities? And it's pretty clear from the response we got in organising this event that, to be blunt, disarmament is not very important to them. It's not to say it means nothing to them, but of course Geneva is a very busy town with many issues and meetings going on they have to cover, and if they're honest they will say, okay, we would like to come to your event and talk about disarmament, but we have 5 other priorities that take precedence. And I think you may have different opinions, and I'm very eager to hear them, but to me that suggested either we're not doing well enough in terms of explaining and making it clear to those organisations why disarmament is important to them, why why they should engage, why it's in their interest to engage, not that we want them, but that they should want it. I think we need some deep thinking about and dialogue with them about why we should have this relationship. It's easy to say we need to strengthen partnerships. That's something, you know, a paragraph that everybody can put in every document. Yes, partnerships good to do things better, more people. But when you get down to it, what's in it for the partner, and why would they want to be engaged? What can we make? How can we show that disarmament and the work that we do here is relevant to their interests and priorities? So I hoped we'd have a couple of representatives who might be able to talk about regional questions from the floor. If they're here, I don't see them, but if they're here, please jump in soon. And so what I suggest we do now is move to the final stage of our discussion, which is the discussion. And particularly to talk about the UN disarmament machinery, what the Secretary-General's agenda describes as retooling multilateral disarmament processes and institutions. I just as a shorthand, say the disarmament machinery. I think you all know what we're talking about. The Conference on Disarmament, the First Committee, the Secretary-General's Advisory Boards, the Disarmament Commission, which I always forget because I think everyone always forgets it. So these are our tools, these are our forums, these are our ways of working currently. What do we need to do with them? To address some of the questions we've heard from our guests today, to deal with these regional questions and making disarmament relevant again to other organisations and potential partners. Empowering youth. I mean, from what I've heard from Ronit today, I get the impression that youth are already empowered, and it's really us, the disarmament machinery, that needs a bit of empowerment. They're going ahead anyway. So let's talk about that. I saw Sergey with his hand up, so please, Sergey, you have the floor as well.
I hope it works. Thanks, Richard. And actually, I didn't have any sort of well-elaborated thesis in my mind. When I asked for the floor, it was a kind of, let's say, instinctive reaction to the first two speakers, who presented their case or whatever they wanted to say, I think, extremely well. But, well, I'll try anyway. It would be also a bit based on some of my recent personal experiences. Of course, Ronit was talking about youth, but youth in a certain, let's say, social or whatever cultural segment, that is university education, and young people who look into, let's say, the newest and beyond achievements in various scientific fields, like biology in her case. Which actually led me to think that the two aspects, youth and education, whatever, and science actually, is a very important, or are also the two very important aspects. Because disarmament traditionally was, or owes many of its achievements to important scientists, including in the nuclear area, in chemical area, in biological area. They were leaders in science who either managed to mobilize political crowds or masses of people, or at the same time offer wise solutions on a more technical level about how you can resolve this or that. And science, I think, is one of the areas which really requires a lot of attention from those who care about disarmament. Because, you know, science itself has changed a lot since those days when there could be leaders. Science, on the one hand, actually, as a process, as the attack on the unknown has widened its let's say, geographical sphere, and at the same time, I'm afraid, became more compartmentalized in the sense, in a social sense, and also in the sense, and I think, Ronit, you mentioned something going in that direction, about young future scientists having entrepreneurial ambitions. So they are very interested in discovering something or proving that whatever they have discovered is going to work. They don't have time, they don't have incentive, actually, to think about global, let's say, security consequences. If you look at, I'm saying because I'm looking at, how various issues in this sphere are being covered, or what reaction they get on social networks like, well, Twitter, for example. There's strikingly little about new scientific achievements and breakthroughs in connection with their security consequences. There's a lot, though, about new achievements, whatever breakthroughs, in connection with how they would improve warfighting. A lot. So, great interest. Everyone is immediately jumping on and expressing his or hers not necessarily a very wise opinion. Okay. Now, this has to be somehow to be overcome. And it seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong, I don't know, that where you have to go at are the universities. And again, your example. Now, if we are complaining that there are not enough women in disarmament delegations, it does reflect the fact that until recently, there were not enough women in foreign ministries, and even less so in general military headquarters. And I don't think you can address the immediate objective of having complete equality in disarmament delegations if you don't address those other more fundamental things. And here again, this is where education counts. Well, please stop me if I'm beginning to talk too long.
I don't think you've ever done that.
Okay, thank you. Anyway, I wanted to share one experience, which is experience from Russia, where I come from, where various think tanks which work and universities which have something to do with disarmament, non-proliferation, and things like that, all concentrated in Moscow. And I thought maybe I should try to widen that. And it's absolutely accidentally that I became a member of Foundation Council in St. Petersburg University, and I started working there on this issue. So there is a program of international a master's program, bilingual Russian-English, and they now want to become one of the sources of academic knowledge and education on arms control, non-proliferation, disarmament. Well, I feel that I am talking for too long.
We can come back. I mean, why don't we take a few other comments and then we'll come back to you.
Yeah. Well, I think I stop it.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I mean, they're all great points as always. Let's keep in mind. I think your point about the involvement.
Excuse me. One thing that I actually wanted to finish with, still being on my last point. Maybe it would be useful. I don't know for whom, for UNIDIR, or maybe for UNODA Geneva, where they have different officers responsible for let's say, disarmament fellowship and some small convention and what have you, to start building some kind of community of university courses or programs or faculties around the world dealing with arms control, disarmament, non-proliferation, and from time to time, having, I don't know, some kind of meetings with them, maybe on a regional basis, maybe not so often on a global basis, but at least have this kind of a program. Help them connect with each other, know each other better, and so on and so forth. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that very concrete suggestion at the end, which I think we've certainly taken note of. And this is what I'm hoping we could come to, is some really specific ideas of how to move these things forward. So thank you for that. You had something to respond to, Lee?
I just wanted to address three things just quickly. One, in response to the fact that iGEM is only engaging with university students. While it is predominantly university students, they also do engage with community labs, and so there's this whole new movement of sort of creating these labs that are very accessible to kind of anyone who has an idea in the community, which is not necessarily gives the sense of security that everyone would want. So iGEM is making an extra effort to partner with those community labs and make sure that they have this sort of regulation in place and kind of are thinking about these things. And the second point is that I think the interesting thing about iGEM and the way that they encourage people to really think about these things seriously is by framing it as a competition. And you lose points if you don't address these concerns. And one of the things that you were mentioning was that there's no incentive, and I think that iGEM presents one kind of means of incentivizing, but obviously you can't really globalize that, but kind of thinking about what is the actual core of what's driving people when it comes to these competitions and how we can kind of take that away from just this one particular example and kind of globalize that, I think is an interesting point to explore. And then the final point is about engaging university students on these topics. And I just wanted to share a story from my experience at MIT. So when I came back from the Biological Weapons Convention, I was inspired, I was ready to go, this is all the classes that I'm going to take that are going to help me prepare. And so I wanted to take a class called Ethics for Engineers, which I think is an important and vital class. And I really think that people graduating with these technical degrees should not be leaving without at least stopping and considering these ethical dilemmas and challenges that their work poses. Because while I don't assume any malintent on any of my fellow students, a lot of them might not stop to think about the context in which they're doing their work, and they're very easily sucked into that kind of go, go, go mentality that I was speaking about before, and really could be developing a really dangerous tool without even realizing it, because they're just so fascinated by the problem. I hear that a lot at MIT is, we don't really care what it is that we're doing, we just want to solve this problem, and I think that that's terrifying, and we should at least have them thinking about these things. And so I was really excited to take this class, and so I went to the department and I was like, okay, great, I want to be able to take this class, and I want it to be able to fulfill a requirement or something, because there's pretty stringent kind of this, you have to take this, then that in order to graduate on time. And it turns out that instead of ethics for engineers being a requirement that I had to take, it was actually going to detract from my path to graduation to take the class. I would have to give up. It wouldn't fulfill any of my other requirements, and I'd have to take away from something else that I was planning on taking that semester. And that was a very, very frustrating experience, and really kind of enlightened me on where MIT stands on a lot of these things. And I think in a lot of ways, MIT holds this golden standard of being like this place of research and development and all these things. And if that's what's happening at the undergrad level, it's a scary reality.
Thanks, Ron. Yes, that's quite a depressing story. Did I see a hand over here? Yeah, okay. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Florence. I work for the Quaker United Nations office, and I just wanted to say something about youth and women, because I happen to be both, or I think I am at least. And I think just in general in the workspace, I think there's this underlying problem of being able to go up as a young woman, and that people very often quickly look at the time when you graduated, make the quick calculation and go, ooh, perhaps not. And I think that's across the board an issue, and I think all the more in sort of disarmament, the sort of hard diplomacy kind of world where that doesn't happen. And a test I've always wanted to make, and I won't do it today, so don't worry, is to ask people who are not interns and under 30 to stand up. I'm pretty sure that most of us will stand up. Perhaps I'll be the only one. But I think that is an issue, and I think that's something that we all need to address internally in our organizations, but also in our missions, is to take that chance and actually take that newly graduate from masters, because increasingly people will have to study until they're 26 or 27. So I think that's something that's a reality across the board, and I think that needs to be addressed amongst everyone and not just in the disarmament spheres. Although I absolutely agree that the fact that everybody's an average of over 50 and male does not encourage women's participation either. It's a terrifying environment to enter, not least that because everybody knows each other and because everybody's been there for 30 years, you come as the newbie, you come as the youth and the women, and I think that's something that needs to be discussed more. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Florence. It's a very chilling point. Okay, I see hands flying up. Kirsten was next, and then Daniel.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks to both of our panelists. There's so many different things I'd like to jump in on. I'm going to try to limit myself to just a few brief points. First, to Sergey, your issue on disarmament, non-proliferation, training, and education, there was a group of governmental experts, commissioned by the General Assembly back in 2001 and 2002. I remember it because I was a member of that group, right? Mm-hmm. So I would stand up in your little game over there. So I'm old. But there was a GGE about this, and that was exactly one of the recommendations, right? That the UN, and I think even ODA was tasked with it, would be how, bringing together people who develop curriculum in university courses and all of that about arms control and training, being a repository of these curricula, so we can engage with university youth and even other youth. The issue with disarmament education, for short, is that there's never any money in it, right? And that governments, that issue has been so hard to get funded. Right? Are we willing to invest in that? Are we willing to put money on the table to sponsor iGEM teams? Right? Because, frankly, if we want to bring Ronit's enthusiasm to our discussions and the solution orientation that we hear when she speaks of her and her colleagues and teammates, and frankly, your technical knowledge, because you probably know more than all of us together, maybe with the exception of Daniel, about biological weapons and the potential for good and harm, we're going to have to ask ourselves, are we ready to pay for that, right? Because that experience and knowledge and enthusiasm costs something, and are we going to invest in it? So that's one quick point. And I also just wanted to drill down on the thing about regional organizations. In our disarmament community, bless them, the EU is a very active participant, and that's wonderful. Right? And not only a very active participant, but also funds so much in this field. Wonderful. But it's very distressing as one of the dialogue organizers, as part of this series, that it was so difficult to secure participation from somebody from a regional organization. And I realize these people are covering a lot of issues. They're small. Sometimes it's one person, right? But at the same time, it's most of these regional organizations represent regions that are disproportionately affected by armed conflict and violence. And so shouldn't they be actually our first clients? Shouldn't they be the people that we are talking to and engaging with? So it's also, moving away from regional organizations, it's telling how difficult it's been to engage in these dialogue discussions our colleagues from other parts of the UN system, from human rights, from migration, from health, etc. So building partnerships, if we take this really seriously, building partnerships is not like that movie long ago about, build it and they will come. Like we're few and far between that are really passionate about disarmament, right? We're going to have to take our passion and go to them and do exactly what you said. Our work fits in with your work, and us doing our work effectively will make your work more effective. So what are we willing to do to build these partnerships? What are we offering these other communities, whether they're youth, whether they're women, whether they're other regional organizations or other international organizations or the UN system? What are we willing to offer them to make them part of this conversation? So that's just a question I'm putting out there.
You haven't answered, right?
There's smarter people than me in this room.
All right. Thank you, Kirsten. Let's go to Daniel next, and then Ambassador Gaffey.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks to both panelists as well. I'm Daniel Feeks. I'm the head of the Implementation Support Unit of the Biological Weapons Convention. I was the secretary at the meeting that Ronit and her colleagues came to last year, so I'm really delighted to hear that you went to the meeting and you still have this enthusiasm and this kind of there are many other people that go to those meetings and have completely the other idea. So I think that's great. So it's really good. It's really good that you're back here in Geneva as well. iGEM is a great thing. It's good that you guys came to the meeting last year. You did the side event here. You spoke to lots and lots of delegates. I was just reading the kind of reports that you guys wrote when you came back from being here in Geneva, and you can see, you can sense the enthusiasm that you all have from being here and everything. So I think, that's great. That's great for us to hear as well. And I wish more of the people, the delegates that attended that meeting would kind of read those reports that you guys wrote as well. And like I said, iGEM is a great thing, and we have links. Richard knows, iGEM has been involved in BWC meetings for many years. A former colleague of ours is now part of the iGEM management, the leadership there, Piers Millet. And we've been working, we had one of your iGEM ambassadors at a regional workshop. Ana Cifuentes came to the regional workshop that we did in Mexico a few months back. We've got another workshop coming up in the Philippines, and we hope, and just discussing that workshop now, and we hope that perhaps we can get someone from iGEM, perhaps someone from the region, to come to that workshop as well. On education, iGEM, you said just now, it's a kind of it's a competition. And it made me think of other things at the kind of the level of education of students, even going down to high school, or perhaps even younger, is Model UN stuff, which is probably something that some people here are more familiar with. But that's also, I found, is a great way to get people engaged. We've spoken to the GMUN students when they come here in Geneva. When I was working at OPCW, Chemical Weapons Organization in The Hague, we had a very good relationship with the local Dutch Model UN organization as well. So I think that's another good way to get young people, students involved as well. One of the things I find a lot with education is that people will immediately come up, and one thing that will get funded, going to your point, Kirsten, about resources, is producing modules, producing some kind of educational module or e-learning. Often these things are produced at quite big expense sometimes, but I don't know, I've never seen any kind of study as to how widely they're used. There are actually lots of them out there. We have some of them on our website. ODA has some on its website in New York. But who's using these things? And how often do the people that produce those, and I've done some of this as well, do we actually talk to the teachers and the professors, the lecturers who would actually use it? Is it actually useful for them? Can they take a standalone module written by someone else and incorporate that into their lessons? Most of these things are only in English, for example. How does that work in other, getting it into other languages? And can a teacher just take something that's been produced by someone else and slot it into their own national syllabus, their own national framework? So it's good to speak to other organizations. UNESCO is a good example, does lots of work around the world on education. And then mentioning the regional workshops we were doing made me pick up on, think about something Kirsten just mentioned. Richard, you were talking about regional organizations and you didn't mention the European Union. We get, and as you're aware, we get a lot of funding, a lot of support for the Biological Weapons Convention from the European Union. The two workshops I mentioned, Mexico and the Philippines, both funded by the EU. The EU is funding a lot of other work we do, so there are regional organizations out there that are funding, that are interested in this area. The EU is very active in BWC and more widely in disarmament as well. And we work with others as well, the OSCE, we work with CARICOM, OAS, the African Union in particular as well. Every year for the past 3 years, we've organized workshops on the BWC with the African Union in Addis Ababa. We're doing one soon with IGAD in East Africa, the Intergovernmental Authority for Development, and then also ASEAN is particularly active in terms of biosecurity stuff as well. So there are regional organizations out there, so it's a shame that none of them were willing or able to come here and to talk, but there are certainly regional organizations that are very active in this field as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Daniel. And certainly, it was certainly a rather glaring omission on my part not to mention the European Union when I ran through the list of regional organisations. The reason we didn't approach them to talk at this particular meeting, even though, as you quite rightly say, they are very heavily engaged in disarmament and funding disarmament and promoting disarmament around the world, is that so much of our discussion is often very Eurocentric, and we're really trying to globalise it, if you like. And an interesting feature of a lot of the EU's work on disarmament is that it's not so much focused on Europe itself, it's outward-looking.
I mean, that's what I was just going to respond to what you said. Everything that they're doing, for the BWC is elsewhere. It's in other places. It's we've got a lot of work that's focused on work in developing countries. We're working with 10 specific developing countries to help them implement the BWC. So it's all of that work that they're doing at least is outside of Europe.
So thank you, Daniel. You've brought up lots of very specific activities and contributions that are already taking place. And on that note, I want to sort of swing back to gender for a second and give the floor to Ambassador Gaffney from Ireland, who has also, I think, some specific things to...
Well, we'll see, and I hesitate, obviously, to talk now on youth and women, because demonstrably I am neither. Look at me, I look like I'm part of the problem we've been defining. But maybe we can help find some solutions here. Just quickly on youth, because I mean, congratulations on making this conversation so dynamic in the face of an oncoming Geneva holiday. So I mean, really, it's congratulations to the panelists on that. First of all, on youth, I want to say, because Ronit, you really put it up to us. You've said a few things that we should be disturbed by. It struck me in my last job before I came here to Geneva a year ago was in development. And it really struck me that looking at the SDGs, which is a framework for interconnectedness and integration, that the first people to get it are the young, connected generation that is coming up through our schools and our colleges, but even through our primary and second level schools. They get that interconnectedness and they get the challenge. The last people, unfortunately, to get it are the senior levels of national administrations, because they have worked their way up through the system, which is defined in a way, which is a siloed system always. And then they bring this to their international engagement and diplomacy. And so there is a real challenge there in terms of the age profile and how you come through a diplomatic career or so how do we engage youth more, and not just in the way of what can seem at times a slightly condescending choosing of youth delegates, and which often make us feel good and one youth delegate feel good, but don't necessarily bring the perspectives to us. The disturbing thing that you said, which we really need to think of while we're still around the table, those of us, is if the young, thinking, educated, and other people are dismissing government and government service and public engagement as a solution to problems. That's a real challenge to the United Nations. It's a real challenge also in the area of disarmament. So and my fear would be, if you look at certain issues in disarmament, especially the new emerging issues, that we in our structures and in our people are discussing the issues, but defining the problems in ways that younger people, more familiar, educated and connected in these areas, wouldn't even look twice at. We're in different worlds. So there's a real challenge there. Easier perhaps is the question of women. Well, it's not. It's part of the same dimension. Diplomacy was always a very male area. And it has taken really strong, determined action to start breaking down gender barriers in diplomacy. And inevitably, it started in the nice so-called soft areas of human rights and the Third Committee, as you have shown. But disarmament and security policy have always been strongly male-dominated areas. And they are talking essentially about the survival of a world, the population of which is 51% women. So there's a moral imperative, but there's also a certain stupidity, frankly, in defining problems only by the thoughts, views, and interests of one community which has always been privileged. So we can, the Secretary General recognises we genuinely cannot continue that way. We in Ireland have focused quite a lot in recent years on the question of gender and disarmament. And inevitably, the conversation, it's very hard to get the conversation beyond the women at the table issue. Well, number one, because you have to start there, and it's so glaringly obvious, you have to start there. And it's sometimes easier for delegations to say, yeah, we'll discuss having women at the table. But it's hard to get beyond that, and it's hard to get beyond the standard paragraph towards the end of a statement that says that we recognise the need. And I think, Renata, you've done a very good job there of explaining to us why it's essential that we start to go more deeply into the gender dynamics at play in each disarmament framework. And I just wanted to mention, it's been slow progress. What we're trying at the moment is there's a group in Geneva called the Gender Champions, and I know the Secretary General is very strongly supportive of it, and Michael Muller is, and it's people. It's a bit hierarchical because it's people at senior levels trying to break down gender barriers. But that's in a way the way you have to start in Geneva, and hopefully we break down more than gender barriers. But there hasn't been a focus on disarmament on that, and so we with Namibia and thankfully with UNIDIR. Are now about to launch a disarmament impact group in the International Gender Champions Network. And what I just wanted to say here is that we want to open up to all interested disarmament people here in Geneva on this, because we want to start by identifying, say, 3 to 4 relevant disarmament events or discussions in the year, where we can really look to make a deep difference on the gender dimension of the discussion, where we would convene gender briefing in advance of the discussions to bring in experts and analysis of the gender issues, so that we can kind of look for areas for coordinated action and bring them into the discussions. And I think we have to take that sort of action, because it's not going to happen naturally, and there is resistance, frankly. It is important to bring more women to the table, but as Renata Dalaqua said last week, that's only the start of the process. So this will be something that we're going to really push at starting now over the next year, and we'd really want to reach out beyond just the ambassadorial champions to make this a real effort. And we'll also be organising in New York on the 15th of October, taking advantage of the First Committee and the presence of Geneva and New York and disarmament experts, an event on gender in the Secretary General's agenda. And it strikes me that, Ronit, we might benefit very much if you could come along to it as well. It just strikes me. So I just wanted to take advantage of this discussion to say that some of us old males are trying to make progress and to reach out and have concrete action rather than just words at the end of statements. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador, for that response. And the news about the Disarmament Impact Group, which goes by the excellent acronym of DIG, and I really encourage everyone to engage with that. It is really something very specific that can be done and is being done. Renata wanted to say something about that. Before you do, Renata, I've just made a note, Ambassador, of your comment, which I think would go well for your epitaph or someone's. Easier, perhaps, is the question of women. Renata, please.
I think it will be my epitaph if you quote it again. Maybe that. So we'll move along.
Yes, I wanted to thank you, Ambassador Gaffi, also for his enthusiasm and support in these issues. As Renata Dalaqua had said, women at the table, it's a start. It's not an end in itself. The goal is to have more diversity of perspectives represented in disarmament bodies. And I think when I presented the data here, it's not only because we are in the business of doing research that I presented, is that what does not get measured does not count, and what does not get measured cannot be fixed. So I think it is important that we are doing that. We can try to identify patterns, trends. We can also, in the future, we can also have a look of which countries are doing better and in terms of gender representation, gender balance, and what are there lessons, are there things in common, are there policies that we can try to identify and broadcast and try to see if they may be applicable to other countries or just like a general best practice. So I think these numbers are a part of the solution, and the solution is not only women at the table, it's what the Secretary General said, it's the equal, full, and effective participation of women trying to achieve advanced disarmament.
Ronit, yes, you have a date on the 15th of October.
Sure, I mean, I'm always happy to attend, but I just wanted to address a few things about your first point that you were making about this interconnectedness that the youth has and sort of this intuitive grasp of technology that I think is very apparent, that there's like a vast generational gap that exists there. And you see new things come out all the time, and the young generations, they're not fazed by it anymore. It's just so fast, but it's also not something that they're thinking about. And I love sitting down with my grandparents to explain to them how something works, because it really does force me to stop and be like, wait, this isn't necessarily the most intuitive thing, but it feels so natural. And there's almost a danger in that. It's just, there's this sort of feeling of inevitability of we're going to merge with our technology and all these things that I think we don't think about because it feels so obvious to us, but that's because we don't really know anything else. And also, to make the point about the ways to go about engaging youth and talking about, Daniel mentioned that these online courses and kind of putting information out there is not necessarily enough, because we're flooded with so many different sources of information. And I think we were just saying this at lunch, that like you have access to all world knowledge in your pocket at all times, and we've grown up with all that access, and we use it for social media and figuring that out. So trying to leverage the things that people are already using, they're not necessarily going and finding online videos, but unless they happen to pop up on your Facebook page and they're very engaging. So we have to think about sort of changing how you kind of get that information, because otherwise it just gets lost in the flood of information that's coming in.
Okay, so I had Hayley, and then the gentleman in the green shirt has been very patient. So Hayley first.
Okay. Right, great. Thank you very much. So, yes, my name is Hayley Ramsey-Jones. I'm from SGI Office of the UN Affairs. I have two very quick questions that I'd like to pose. Firstly, for Ronit. You mentioned the regional ambassadors for iGEM, and in looking at particular regions that may be underrepresented at iGEM. And I was just wondering, because you said that part of the problem is that there's not a lot of money. So I'm wondering whether they are sort of supported through other ways and other resources or other means, if you can talk a bit about that. And for UNIDIR, I was just wondering, when you're doing your gender analysis, whether you're also taking an intersectional approach and looking at other aspects like race, ability, class, and other such issues that affect marginalised and typically underrepresented people. Thank you.
So in terms of the ambassador program, I'm not an ambassador, but I would be happy to connect you with people who are very involved in this program. But a lot of the funding is private funding that comes from various different sources. I mean, also, I'm not necessarily the best person to speak about that because I didn't have to do that fundraising, but just hearing the challenges that these teams had to go through, and the funding was there, and then it wasn't, and then people were pulling out, and then, you know, they had like local government came up a lot in terms of they were going to support this, and then last second backing out because funds shifted or something like that, and kind of doing science in the face of that uncertainty was very challenging, and something I think that the ambassadors are there to sort of ensure that once a government or a private source is guaranteeing that funding, that they actually follow through on that, because that's another big issue. But definitely there needs to be more sources, and that's something that they're actively working on, and I'd be happy to connect you with the head of that program.
Hi, yes. So instinctively, I would like to say that yes, the intersectional approach totally makes sense, especially when we are talking about a diversity of perspectives. This would be a more complex research project than the one we have right now, and again, funding would be required. Also to get into, to include other variables in our analysis. But I guess it's something we should, aspire to. And at the moment, our gender and disarmament program is just starting. But as it gains space and resources, I'd be very, very excited to address these other issues as well.
Okay, thank you both. Thank you for the question, Haley. Next, sir, back there.
Good evening, everyone. I'm with the OHCHR. I'm an intern, but I actually have several years in grassroots activism on issues of peace and human rights and environmentalism. And I guess I wanted to share the first bit of good news from the United States is that I think there's an unprecedented amount of civil society engagement by women. You see movements like the Women's March, where literally the largest mass mobilization in American history is happening and being led by women. And that's very promising to me, even if the governments aren't necessarily behind initiatives of peace or disarmament, especially the current administration. But to see women who traditionally have not been the leading voices in the political arena, taking to the streets, going into the halls of Congress, going to city councils and town halls, and realizing that movements like this, and I think it's a model that all countries, open democracies, could learn from, the Women's March, a very distinctive pro-peace agenda. And I think that peace and disarmament go hand in hand, and if they're not, then I think there's a very serious issue. I mean, if the end goal of disarmament is not peace, then I don't know what it's for. But that being said, I think that I very much agree with what's been said here, and wish I could have been present for some of the other previous sessions. But as far as the thoughts that have, the solutions to incentivizing international actors to make this a priority, I think there are three key linkages that need to be emphasized. One, with those countries that are dealing with terrorism and with crime, realizing that, you know, what's the correlation between the flow of arms and arms production and arms sale and violent crime? In America's case in point, I think, you know, you look at the amount of gun crimes in America relative to the number of arms being sold, and it's terrifying, the statistics. And the second one, this should bring everyone to the table, because it is an issue not just of international security, but it's an issue of human survival, which is the environmental linkage between arms production specifically the production processes and the mass financing of weapons and the carbon toll. I mean, how much energy does it take to melt down a bullet and melt every component of a tank or an airplane? I mean, these are very, very serious environmental concerns that I think should bring everyone who has any hope for a future generation or any love of their children or next generations to the table. And so maybe perhaps these linkages can be emphasized. And then the last linkage, I think, goes directly to social services and I guess more social justice notions of, education, healthcare, pensions. If even and peace building for that matter, and the sustainable development goals, if even a fraction of what's spent on arms is spent on those priorities for the betterment of society and humanity, we can solve a lot of problems. But I think if the governments are not willing, then go directly to civil society and empower and activate civil society, which is something that OHCHR tries to do. Thank you all for your time.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for these observations and your three very specific ideas about these linkages. It's something we don't often hear in the disarmament space here in Geneva, at least. For example, the point about the carbon cost of arms production, the environmental cost of the arms industry. It's not something that comes up very often. So thank you for raising it. And what you've said, I mean, certainly gives for me some new ideas about possible partnerships. We're talking about partnerships. None of the things you mentioned were covered in the Secretary General's agenda, but that's so much the better. Now we've got a little bit more to work with. So thank you for raising that. I'll be seeing you after class. Kirsten, please.
Sorry to take the floor again, but I know we're going to have a drink afterwards. I wanted to say, the SG's agenda doesn't have an expiration date, right? And as Richard said, this is the beginning of a conversation. This has been the fourth in our series. I think it's clear, particularly on this chapter on partnerships, we've had an opportunity to kind of drill down into youth question, on gender, but there's a lot of other things in that chapter, and again, coming back to the disarmament machinery and retooling, and that probably deserves its own dedicated discussion, I would think, because there's a lot of suggestions over the years of what we could do with the disarmament machinery. Building external partnerships is part of it, but it's also looking at our own policies and practices and rules of procedure, and do we need an SSOD4, and or not, or what can we do without having an SSOD4? So I just wanted to mention that the High Representative for Disarmament is really interested in getting feedback from these dialogues. She's going to attempt to be in Geneva before the first committee to get some feedback from stakeholders about the agenda, about the conversations we've been having. And I look forward that we really start drilling down into what are we going to do about it. I think we spent a lot of time getting good information about the value of the partnerships. I want to know how we're going to build them. So.
Thank you, Kirsten. We're really focusing on that because that's my question too. Before we perhaps have a final talk about that, let me just go to the gentleman at the very back who's been waiting patiently. I'm sorry I didn't see you before.
So I'll introduce myself. I want to challenge the qualification the chair gave me, gentlemen. There is this frequent misunderstanding. Before people hear me, but after they would never call me a gentleman. I am Boris Engelson, an accredited journalist and a very bad guy. So I like to make three quick remarks. First, on gender issue. In France, there used to be a female Minister of Defense, and I think Chirac or Sarkozy, I can't remember, she was really for gender equality because although she was a lady, a woman, she did not systematically side with women. For instance, when the movement, the revolution started in Tunisia, which was good for Tunisian ladies, she sided with Ben Ali and instructed Ben Ali how to subdue the demonstrations, and eventually she had to resign. So that's my contribution to gender issue in terms of armament, defense, etc. Second, concerning age, I also plead guilty of not being the right gender and the right age. And when I heard the Russian gentleman speak of the need for community, peace-loving people with scientific caliber, it reminded me some archaic, prehistoric memories of the time when I was young and promising like you. But I could not remember the name of that movement. So I left the room since I was instructed that new wave people are connected, they are high-tech, they go to Google and Facebook, and I tried to find introducing each and every possible keyword on that remarkable memory, and I couldn't find. Then I went to the Russian gentleman, asked his name and affiliation. I realized he's a representative of the Pugosh movement, who was very instrumental in the 70s, 80s, possibly even 60s in bringing together the peace-loving nuclear scientists from East and West. And this is a magic page of your issues, but thanks God, all the old people will die soon, and you will not have to go through all these pages of history to make smart careers. I wish you good luck. And the third remark I wanted to make, I heard that UNESCO is a good example. This is really good news because, to my own experience, UNESCO has never been a good example of anything. I think very poorly of all UN agencies, but for me the worst is UNESCO. So I'm very rejoiced to know that now UNESCO is a good example. And so I don't have to order you not to call me again a gentleman. You will never call me anyhow a gentleman again.
Thank you. Still happy to call you a gentleman, but if you prefer to be a bad guy, that's fine too. And I think
That's the only thing I do well.
Okay, well, you're very welcome, and thank you for your comments. Thank you for mentioning Pugosh, which, as you say, is a very important example of a partnership involving scientists that was, as you rightly say, crucial during the Cold War as a means of reducing tensions and leading to some very important breakthroughs in disarmament. I had Kate Sullivan.
Yeah, to the ungentleman in the back. I think that pointing out that more could be done isn't suggesting that good things haven't been tried. And the fact that women have occasionally been engaged in high positions in disarmament is not really the end state that we're seeking. So it might be a little bit simplistic, this view that you've presented.
I am not sure I got your...
I'm Kate Sullivan. I'm from the Global Challenges Foundation.
Yeah, congratulations. I was mentioning that minister who was a lady and behaved as usually worse than the male counterpart, and ask the Tunisian women if you don't believe me. But I do not mean that it will be the same each time. I would just mean the reason I was teasing you on that is that there is much more and much more interesting things to say about gender issues in terms of war, peace, disarmament, and history than just the figure of number of women in each ministry and in each commission. I think this is really a very primary school approach, and I think that reading Tolstoy books would be, in that case, much more inspiring. But all my great passions in life have always started with a Scrabble, so I am happy to Scrabble with all of you today, and then we are in for great adventures together.
Thank you. I don't think what you said is actually at all in contradiction to what we've discussed, but I'll let Renata.
Yes, so I focused in two different aspects of gender parity. One is about representation, and you can say that's very primary, you don't see the importance of that. I cannot argue with that. But the second part was about gender perspectives informing disarmament discussions. And this is not only women that can ask these questions, men can also ask, and I hope they do. And I don't think we need to have 50-50% to be able to tackle gender problems. I just wanted to show that not only me, The Secretary General said that in the agenda, that gender parity is a goal of the United Nations. And it's not an end in itself. It's a part of a process that in the end we want to achieve disarmament. That's also the mandate of the UN. So I wanted to say that my presentation was not only about counting women, it was about making sure that gender perspectives and concerns are being taken into consideration in disarmament forums. But again, I also think it is important that we have these numbers, that we have a baseline that we can monitor if we are walking towards our goal, which is gender parity or not. And what are the obstacles on our way, and ideas that we can put in place to overcome those obstacles. On the issue of how we're going to move ahead with partnerships, and I think this is something many people have thought about it in the UN. New ideas, new formats, multilateral, unilateral, multi-stakeholder, bilateral, this type of things. I think the initiative that Ambassador Gaffi mentioned, the Disarmament Impact Group, is a new idea. It is a very, quite flexible format. It's open to member states, representatives, and disarmament practitioners which are interested in advancing the gender agenda in specific disarmament discussions. UNIDIR is happy to be co-chairing this initiative with the Government of Ireland and Namibia. And we hope to spark interest among the community here. That may be a new type of partnership for us to explore.
Thank you, Renata. And thank you, bad guy or gentleman, as you prefer, for bringing this up, because it was an important clarification to make. I had a lady at the very back corner.
Thank you very much. I'm Shukuko Koyama. I used to work actually at UNIDIR about 15 years ago. And Richard, it's very nice to see you. Perhaps I should come and introduce me again later. But having left UNIDIR 15 years ago, I joined academia. So I'm now teaching at university in Japan called Waseda University. And there I have, mingling with lots of students. So I have a question first to Ronit. You briefly mentioned about your experience of taking a class which is talking about ethics in biology or biological engineering. Maybe you did mention, but I kind of missed it. Why did you take that class at the very beginning? The reason why I'm asking the question is that since I'm teaching peace and security issues, I get to meet lots of students who are interested in disarmament, very passionate, but I'm more sort of interested in about the majority of students that I haven't reached out, who are not interested in disarmament or who never heard of the word disarmament. But there are I have many Asian students who are majored in engineering and in medical science, and these are the ones that I would like to reach out, but then it's very difficult for me to kind of sensitize them to know about it. So because I think it's really student spontaneity that they would become very passionately involved in that. So can you share a little bit of your kind of personal experience, why you're taking up this ethical issues? Very interesting. And I have a quick question to Renata. Again, I'm speaking with lots of young students, and then they are finding themselves more outside of this dichotomy of sexes. They don't really, more and more students don't really identify themselves either women, men. Yeah? So I just would like to hear your idea about how this UNIDIR research is dealing with this dichotomical sex relationship. I think feminist scholars use this word heteronormativity, I'm not sure. So is there any way for you to bringing in other perspectives, let's say LGBT identifications or masculinity issues and all that? Thank you.
Thank you, Shikoko, and it's nice to see you again. Ronit, if you could tackle the first part of the question.
So I think the specific class and the specific reason that I was interested in it was directly because of my experiences that I had at the BWC and seeing kind of the scale on which these issues are operating, and I didn't feel necessarily that I had a good basis, a historical basis, but also kind of a philosophical basis to start making my opinions about these things, which I all of a sudden realize are very important, what it is that I think about them, because when I go out and go into the workplace and be an engineer, these questions come up all the time in a way that's sneaky. Like, it doesn't always present itself so obviously. And so it's I really wanted to have sort of that strong foundation on which to sort of build out my own personal perspective. And in terms of engaging engineering students, I think I was unique because I had this unique experience. I think that a lot of engineering students don't want to think about it. They don't want to think about the context. They want to think about the problem. They want to think about it in terms of how is this a puzzle that I can crack or something like that. And so I think kind of understanding their mindset and understanding that, but kind of giving them these perspectives and posing it as another challenge and interesting puzzle, and speaking to engineers in sort of the ways they're used to communicating, and instead of signing long, ancient text, really like making it a dialogue and really using more modern tools that they're used to working with to actively engage them. And I'm happy to speak about it more at length afterwards.
Yes, thank you for your question. So yes, when we're talking about gender, we're not necessarily talking about sex. We're talking about male, female, or non-binary, people that don't identify with either. And we are talking about roles, social roles and norms, and how these have been constructed in our society. And this research that I showed, it's a very simple methodology. We were coding the participants for attending the meetings if they had Mr. or Miss in front of their name. And so we didn't get to interview them, their views on gender or this type of thing. But I think these are new issues for the diplomatic community as well. And it's a conversation that it's more advanced in other fields. But in some senses, we have also been witness to new developments in terms of feminist foreign policies. Sweden launched a handbook of feminist foreign policy a couple of weeks ago, and the book has more than 100 pages, and it talks about what it tries to show what a feminist foreign policy is, and how gender concerns are weaved into different policy issues. So I think that's also that's a rather new development. And I also think at the grassroots level, I think iGEM has also a LGBTI chapter, and so activists on nuclear disarmament are also organizing around this new and these identities. So I think it's something we have to be paying attention to. But at this moment, our research is more simpler than that.
Thanks, Renata. Well, we're coming to the end of our time, ladies and gentlemen, so I'll draw this discussion to a close here. Thank you very much for your contributions. I'm not going to try and summarize everything, but clearly there's great potential here. I think what Ronit had to say, to me at least, shows that there's enormous potential for great involvement of youth, of scientists. Sergey, thank you for raising these previous examples of the importance of engaging scientists and the role that scientists can play, the role young people can play through in education and so on. We haven't talked much about the private sector, but a lot of these concepts also apply, of course, there, and ways we could engage the private sector. We could, as well, as Kirsten said, we could have a separate discussion on the UN machinery. We'd have yet another discussion just about the private sector, perhaps with some private sector representatives to join in that. So thank you very much. I think it was what we'd hoped, that is, the Geneva Dialogues was a dialogue. Thank you for the exchange and the back and forth. It's always good actually to have some disagreements and because that really helps to understand what we're talking about and to develop the concepts and the ideas. So thank you for those who contributed very candidly to the discussion. We have some drinks outside. I know you're tired, it's a long day, you want to get to the holiday, but I'm going to have a beer. I do invite you to join us, at least briefly, and we can perhaps continue some of the discussions we had today. Thank you very much to both our panelists, and especially to Ronit, who's come such a long way. And thank you again all.